Kicked out by my own son, Rafael said as if he were reading a grocery list. Vivian wants the house, Mama. You can go live in the little back house. The words landed like a slammed door. For a moment, the world narrowed to the wood grain of our kitchen table. I could feel every ring and groove beneath my knuckles, smelled the last of the morning coffee, heard the slow tick of the old clock Geraldo had fixed the year we painted the fence. Rafael had said many things to me in his life. Angry things, tender things, foolish things, but never a sentence that asked me to leave the home I had built with the man who had been my life partner for 32 years. I carried the weight of that table with me. It had been both altar and battlefield, the place where bread was broken, where wounds were scabbed with soup and chided with laughter. To be told to leave it by the boy I had carried beneath my heart felt like theft. If this story touches something in you, if your breath hitches at the idea of a mother pushed aside, stay with me. Hit subscribe so we can share more true stories like this one. You should know, before I tell you what came after, where I came from. I was not born to a house with nice floors or silver spoons. I arrived at the farm a young woman with my hair in a braid and a stubbornness that Geraldo recognized the way good farmers know the feel of soil in a bare hand. He taught me first to respect the land, to read the sky, to tie a knot that wouldn't come undone in wind, to trust that work and patience bring harvest. We married in the old chapel in town. The dress had marks on the hem from the barn floor because I'd been out moving a gate the day before. We laughed about that when people asked if I had worn it properly. The farm was small but honest. The house we lived in was the work of our hands. We widened the kitchen ourselves, shifted a wall, laid boards that we stained with the same tea Geraldo used for his beard each morning. The wood stove huffed and took the chill from the air. The well water tasted faintly of iron in summer. All my life between then and Rafael's first step into the world could be measured in chores. A loaf of bread cooling on the sill, the soft thud of laundry on a washboard, a baby's hand curled around my finger while I bent over tomato plants, the smell of basil and soap, the creak of the porch swing, the sputtering radio in the evenings. Those were the hymns of my days. Geraldo and I raised Rafael under those sounds. He was a boy who learned to fetch his own boots at 4 and mend a fence before he was 12. He could plant a row of corn so straight I once bragged to the minister that he had a line other boys could not match. We taught him to work hard and to honor the land that fed him. We loved him with the fierce, ordinary love of two tired people who stayed up late to tuck their son in. We argued sometimes about money, about whether to buy a new tractor, about the right time to sell lambs, but the arguments were always followed by bread and the settling down of things. When Geraldo died, a night I still taste like burning in my mouth from the stove, Rafael was 21, taller than his father already, steady-handed. He carried that grief differently than I did. He buried himself in work, in calculation, in promises he gave himself to keep us afloat. He took over the books, the deliveries, the accounts. He did it with a sense of duty that made me proud. He was mine in the way sons are. He bore my face when he frowned and my stubborn jaw when he refused to be persuaded. For years after, the farm was my devotion. Mornings of making stew for hands calloused from dawn, afternoons of mending nets and tending the garden, evenings of patching quilts by lamplight. I was the one who knew every corner of that house. The drawer with the letters from Geraldo when he was courting me, the tin where we kept the spare keys, the loose board under the staircase where I had hidden a small box of photographs. There were pictures in that box. Geraldo with his hat crooked over his brow, Rafael at 5 with a slingshot on his lap, me with flour in my hair, laughing because someone had tipped my hat off my head. Those photographs kept the house from collapsing into only years. They kept it a living place. When Rafael came to me with Vivian, I liked her at first glance. She had quick laughter and bright shoes that made the chickens pause. She smelled of something like perfume and newness. City smells that made some of the neighbors raise an eyebrow but that I decided did not matter. She was different, but that did not mean she was wrong. She wore her confidence like a coat, and at 25 she carried herself like someone used to having things go her way. I thought maybe she would bring new ideas, help with the paperwork, or at least give my son someone to come home to who would make him happy. At first, she was careful. She asked questions about the recipes, about how to make the bread my mother taught me to bake. She touched the bristles of the broom as if testing whether things should be swept left or right. We had dinner together and I told her stories of Geraldo, how he insisted on painting the fence twice because the first layer hadn't pleased him, How he made a face at the first lamb he held as if to say, "You and I, we will do this." She laughed politely. She posed with Rafael in the garden and posted a picture on that little glowing rectangle people call social now. My own face looked honest in the frame, the kind of face a camera cannot lie about. It changed slowly, the way the erosion of a riverbed takes years. The first tiny cuts were almost invisible. A comment about the way I set the table. A suggestion that the curtains were out of fashion. She rearranged the living room cushions once and then again. When I straightened them, she frowned and did it over. She started inviting friends from the town and speaking in a tone that made the hired hands look away, as if they should not hear how she pronounced the word farm, like it was a place to escape from rather than to cultivate. She criticized the stew at supper in a way that made Rafael flush and say, "She's just teasing, Mama." And we all pretended it was a joke so that the others at the table wouldn't feel the awkwardness. The jokes stopped being jokes. What began as small slights turned into steady undermining. She refused the soup I offered as if it were beneath her. She would roll up the curtains in the morning and say the house smelled old. She shifted the staff's schedules without speaking to me. One afternoon, she moved the box of photographs from the top of the chest to a cardboard carton labeled "Old Stuff" and set it in the hall as if to say these memories no longer had a place in the main rooms. Watching her do that hurt more than any insult she ever spat at me. Rafael saw her through the eyes of a man in love, and a man who had grown used to pleasing the one he thought made him whole. He started saying things like, "Mother, times change," and "You have to understand how she is." He explained her rudeness as city ways, her indifference as directness. He told me once, softly, as if he were trying not to bruise me more, "She cares about the house. She wants things to look a certain way." I wanted to tell him that the house had looked a certain way for us because we had been here in it, because every mark had a story, because each stain on the floor was a memory of something done with love. Instead, I nodded and kept my mouth shut. The day the ultimatum came, the sky was sharp and bright as if nothing heavy could linger in the air. It was harvest season. The corn heater had been humming for weeks. Vivian sat at my table with a posture like a queen on a borrowed throne. Rafael stood in the doorway, his face set. He spoke the words I told you at the top. "You can go live in the little back house." They thought they had said it gently, that the offer of a smaller house with a key would soften the blow, that moving would look like concern, a caretaking gesture. But it was exile in polite clothes. The little back house had been the summer kitchen once, then a shed, then a place where we kept extra chairs. Geraldo had fixed its roof the year Rafael learned to drive, and it had been where I unpicked a wedding dress seam once for a neighbor's daughter. It was never meant for me to be pushed into. Never as long as I could stand upright in the kitchen where we had cooked 100 Sunday dinners. The plate in front of me cooled. It was the stew my mother taught me to make, the sort that could make a child forgive a scolding. I had set it down for Rafael because he had returned late from the fields. He didn't touch it. His hands were folded as if he were carrying the weight of a decision he had not wanted to make. "It's not forever," he said, "just while she gets settled." He smiled a small, pleading smile, the kind that asks for complicity rather than understanding. "We'll fix up the back house, clean it out." I saw the way he looked at Vivian as if he needed her to like him more than he needed his own mother. "If you were in that chair across from me, would you fling your plate at them and walk out? Would you have told him off, shouted the words you knew would cut? I am not the kind to break chairs in anger. Anger and I have this quiet arrangement. She comes to visit, I let her speak, then I send her away with a cup of tea. There was grief under my anger, and grief makes people do strange, small things. I sat there and felt the world rearrange itself in that kitchen. I did not storm out. I did not curse. Instead, I did what I had always done in the soft wars of family life. I counted. I counted the ways we had kept this house, the lists in my head that made the house more than timber and paint. I thought of the garden that my hands had tilled every spring for 20 years. I thought of the mortgage papers, the years of payments that had been done by my husband's calloused hands and later by Rafael's careful signatures. In my mind, I walked every corner and spoke to it like a woman saying goodbye. But I would not be driven into shame. In the days that followed, I made a decision that surprised not only them, but, truth be told, surprised me. I would not plead. I would not cry at the table. I would withdraw my labor, not as some spiteful act, but as a quiet witness. I would stop doing the things that kept the house running the way it had always run. I stopped setting out the morning coffee on the tray in the living room. I stopped sweeping the porch at dawn. I did not stop being awake to what needed doing. I simply refused to be the only one who always did it. The first morning I did this, I watched from the kitchen doorway as the rooster crowed and no coffee came to the table. Vivian looked up from her phone, irritated. "Where is it?" she snapped. Rafael muttered something under his breath. I had thought perhaps they would notice the absence and wonder, but they only adjusted. They shrugged and went to the barns themselves. The men in the fields grumbled about the unmade lunches. The hired girl, Maria, looked at me with something like apology in her eyes. In the old ways of this farm, there had always been a rhythm. One person setting that rhythm, others following. I had broken the metronome and they stumbled. I did not stop because I wanted them to starve. I stopped because I wanted them to see what had been taken for granted. A house held together by one set of hands will look and feel as if those hands are invisible. I wanted visibility. I wanted the truth of the labor to be plain. The empty tray, the pile of laundry not folded, the absence of the small tasks that make a home livable. At night, I sat with my knitting and a cup of sweet tea and watched how they adapted. Vivian's face grew thinner with impatience. Rafael's brow furrowed deeper with worry. But still, they came and went as if the house could be moved like furniture. In those days of withdrawal, I learned things I had not expected about the people I loved. It was easier to see a face once it had been stripped of habitual comforts. I noticed Vivian's shoes, always expensive, always clean, how she carried herself in them to avoid noticing the dirt the farm inched into the hems. I began to notice where she kept her purse and how she glanced at the phone screen as if expecting messages. I learned the times she left the house, the way she avoided the old willow by the creek where Geraldo had carved our names the day he asked me to marry him. People have secrets the same way they have favorite hiding places. They tuck them away and they tend them. Watching this woman walk around my home treating it like a stage set made me wary, and as you learn to look at a field for signs of a pest, I began to take note. One afternoon, some months after the first cold words, I found a phone. It was ordinary. Black, sliver at the edges, screen cracked at one corner. It lay on the dining room chair where Vivian had sat that morning, the screen glowing with a low light because someone had left it squinting. I could have walked away. I could have turned it over to Rafael and said nothing. Instead, my hand, because old habits are true habits, reached for it. Phones are small windows now. They hold the day-to-day life that people do not always bother to announce on the veranda. I did not sit there like someone hungry for scandal. I sat there like someone in possession of a map. There were messages. Not the long, affectionate things the young write when they are secret lovers in novels, but short, curt notes carrying dates, times, and place names. I read a line about meeting at night, another about bring cash, another that used a name I did not recognize, but that repeated like a quiet drum between Vivian and the unknown. I am not one for gossip. I am not a woman who delights in another's ruin. But I could see patterns the way I could see whether a seedbed would flourish, straight lines of text that formed a picture. The texts were not in themselves proof of anything illegal, but they suggested arrangements hidden from the family. They suggested that Vivian's life was divided into neat compartments, and that the house my son and I shared was not the center of some of those compartments. When Rafael found me with the phone, he did not shout. He looked at me the way a person looks at something they know they have missed, with a half-sad astonishment. He reached for the device and read a message I had not yet seen. There was a pause long as a prayer. The color left his face and then came back, as if he were stitching his control again. "I should have known," he said in a voice that was barely his. "I should have—" He did not finish. He left the room like someone trying to catch a memory that kept sliding away. I did not go to him that day. He had to find his own path. I put the phone back where I had found it and went about the rest of my day because a woman's life is not only drama, you must feed lambs, mend fences, and mend the small things so big ones don't get worse. But the discovery of the phone made the air hum. It was a small cross in my chest that would not leave me. I did not tell anyone at first. You learn in years of living that proof gathered without witness is a frail thing. I thought of the photographs in the box, of papers in the desk, of the list of payments and deeds. If something was wrong, I wanted to be sure enough to stand before it without the tremor of uncertainty. The country has a way of remembering who did what, and I would rather be remembered as the woman who acted with sense than as the one who cried and was dismissed. So I watched. I watched Vivian's habits with the kind of patient patience a woman who has raised a son learns. I followed without making myself a spectacle. I sat on benches where neighbors sat and spoke about the weather. I asked about deliveries. I listened to conversations at the store. I observed the time she left the house without explanation. There were moments when I felt ashamed for being curious. A mother's curiosity is not an honorable thing when it crosses into spying. It is a temper you must be careful to keep within the borders of decency. But when your son's heart is at stake, the borders shift. One night, a week after I had first seen the phone, I saw the car. It was late enough for the lights of the town to be mere pinpricks across the valley, and the air had that cool hold that comes before frost. I had been at the window, mending a shirt under the kitchen lamp, when headlights came down our lane. The car pulled up by the road as if someone had told it, "Wait here." I watched Vivian step out, her figure above the small motion of the night, carrying that same sense of being in the world as if it owed her convenience. She crossed the road and climbed into the passenger seat of a vehicle I did not recognize, a dark car that smelled of distant places. My heart thudded in a way that felt like an alarm and a drumbeat at once. I knew, in the way old women sometimes know more than the young, that the next hours would either tell a truth or bury it. I felt that peculiar, awful mixture of fear and resolve. Fear because the truth might be a blade for my son. Resolve because the truth would change the way we could live from then on. I walked to the door as if drawn because a mind needs to see once more what it has only imagined. The car drove off, and the road took it into the throat of the night. I did not leap into my truck and follow. That is a choice you will not find advised in any decent guide, nor would I ever urge anyone to imitate. There are laws and there are morals. I live with both. But something in me that was older than my fear made a plan. If what I had seen was true, and the messages suggested so, I would need more than a mother's suspicion. I would need witnesses, and I would need prudence. I remembered Sir Joachim, a man who had been a friend of the family since the time when Geraldo and he had kept company over coffee and late-night talk of sheep prices. He had been to our house more than once to write letters, to witness a signature, to remind us there was sense in keeping things documented. I would not accuse, but I would bring what I had to a man who could say whether in what I held there was anything that needed careful handling. I dialed his number with hands that did not tremble as much as my heart. He answered on the second ring, as if he had been waiting for reasons that had nothing to do with me. "Come by tomorrow," he said when he heard me out. "Bring whatever you have. Don't go getting into trouble tonight." His voice was a rope through a storm. It steadied me. That night I sat at the kitchen table with Geraldo's old lantern on the shelf and the box of photographs open in front of me. I ran my fingers over the edges of a picture of Rafael at 7, holding a frog with both hands and smiling as if the world belonged entirely to him. I thought of what it means to love someone enough to feel danger for them, as if it's a physical, pressing thing. I thought of the many ways one could be ruined, by debt, by habit, by betrayal. I thought of my own hands, calloused from years of picking beans and mending fences, and how there was a dignity to them that no one could take away by word or by decree. In the days that followed, life carried its ordinary hum. The sheep had to be fed. The well needed mending. The ledger had to be balanced. I went about it with the steadiness of muscle memory, but the knowledge of that car and the messages sat like a stone in my pocket. I found myself walking past the back house and touching the door as if to test its warmth. I found myself wondering whether Rafael had already suspected, whether he had just not wanted to believe. I thought about Vivian's laughter and how it sometimes left a hollow ring in the room like glass that is too thin. There were moments when my courage cracked. I would stand in the yard at dusk and let tears come because there was nothing else to do with the flood. Other women in the neighborhood, those who had been kind to me in the early years, would catch my hand and squeeze. Donna Sebastiana, the midwife who had been at Rafael's birth and mine, made me coffee and sat with me as if she were knitting courage into my bones. She did not ask. She only sat. And the presence of another person in grief is like a beam in a house. It keeps the roof from falling until you can prop it yourself. One afternoon, When the fields had a shimmer of distant green and the children in town were rolling hoops on the square, I watched Vivian meet a man at the general store. They spoke like two people who arranged their lives around hidden appointments. Their voices were low, their smiles careful. The man, clean-shaven, in a coat that cost too much for a farmer, leaned in as if the world outside the general store was of no consequence. They parted and each returned to their business. I felt as if I had been given a fragment of a puzzle and that the fragment was enough to change the picture. I knew then that mere suspicion could not steer me. The house was in danger of being rearranged not by renovations but by decisions that would dispossess me of a life's meaning. If the truth was inconvenient, it would not make itself visible without work. Prudence told me to gather evidence in a way that could be presented, not as a trap, but as a record. So I began to pay attention to patterns. I kept a small notebook where I wrote the times people came and went, the dates of messages when I saw them, the times Vivian left the house. I asked questions at market stalls about deliveries and watched the register carefully when people paid. I did not go looking for drama in the way young people do for sport. I simply put my attention where it was needed. One night, a week after I had seen that car go down the lane and thought about the motel on the edge of town where such meetings often happen, I followed. I say followed, and I mean I drove slowly behind the headlights at a respectable distance, keeping to the speed that good sense demands. I did not speed. I did not crowd. There is a difference between following to know and chasing to punish. I kept that difference in my heart like a compass. The motel was the sort of place with a neon sign that buzzed and a parking lot that had seen better days. It sits there on the highway like a throat clearing. I watched as Vivian's car pulled into a slot, then another vehicle, too familiar now, and they disappeared through the glass door. I sat in the car with my hands folded and felt something like the wind before rain, the sense that this moment would bend the arc of many lives. There are things I could tell you about what happened inside the motel in the hours after without embellishment, how the light in the window fractured faces, how people looked at each other when the truth bared itself. But that part of the story is not for now. For now, I will tell you that when Rafael finally saw, it broke him in a way that had nothing to do with drama, and everything to do with a sudden, clean loss. The loss of a story he had been living where he was the hero and not the fool. I did not throw stones. I did not shout. I did not set fire to the curtains. I waited until I had witnesses. I brought what I had to Sir Joachim. I placed the phone on his desk, along with my notes and the dates that lined up like a fortification. He read them with the careful face of a man who weighs things and counts the consequences. He did not smile in triumph. He did not cheapen the pain by saying, "You were right." He said quietly, "We will make sure what is necessary happens so that the farm is not at risk." Hearing those words was a balm and a blade. Balm because someone had acknowledged the danger. Blade because it meant things would change in ways both necessary and painful. I had not wanted this for spectacle. I wanted it so my son could stand on land that carried both his past and his future. I wanted the farm to be steady for my grandchildren, not rearranged for convenience. That night, as I walked home under a sky full of indifferent stars, I carried with me the small photograph of Rafael with the frog and the list of dates in my head. I felt the house behind me, not the walls, but the years. I thought of Geraldo and how he would have set his jaw and said, "We will see this through." I felt, too, a strange calm. There is a particular silence in the moments after you decide what you must do. It is like the hush in a field before harvest, when the grain stands tall and waits. I returned to the kitchen and sat with a cup of tea. I did not sleep much that night. Part of me was exhausted. Part of me was awake with purpose. You learn at my age that purpose keeps you honest. It keeps you from the petty acts that men and women fall into when they are hurt. The days that followed were careful. I spoke to no one about what I had seen except to Sir Joachim and to a neighbor I trusted, who agreed to be present should any unpleasantness happen. Rafael moved like a man who had been woken from a dream and was trying to find something real under his feet. He did not look at me the same way for a while. Sometimes his face held pity, and sometimes it held anger, two qualities I have learned to accept. He spoke little. Vivian began to avoid the house she had once sought to rule, and when she was present she carried the look of a woman whose secrets were heavy as a winter coat. I am telling you all this, so you might understand why I made the choices I did. I was not driven by vengeance. I I was moved by the responsibility of memory and land. I had spent my life protecting the farm and the values it held. If showing a pattern of deception would save Rafael from a life built on illusions, then I would do what a mother must do. One afternoon, I found a receipt in Vivian's purse, an expense that made no sense if all was as she had said to my son. It was a small thing, a piece of paper, but it proved that there were commitments outside the life she led in our home. When I took it to Sir Joaquim, he folded his hands and said we must document everything. He said also that sometimes the truth is like a seed that must be planted carefully, not cast like a stone. I liked his way of talking because it honored both the law and the quiet of hearts. Then, one evening, as the sky was burning like old paper and the hens came home to roost, I saw the car again. It took the same turn up the lane, and my breath caught as if my own name had been called. This time I did more than watch. I walked to the road and stood in the shadow of the porch where Geraldo used to lean and look at the stars. I did not move. I let the headlights pass, and I traced their taillights as they disappeared until the road was dark again. Standing there, I felt the weight of choices. I was preparing for a reckoning that would hurt those I loved, and that knowledge made my chest ache. Yet I had to do what I could to keep the home intact. A home, once lost, is sometimes impossible to return to unchanged. Inside the house, the radio played the old songs that always made me think of Geraldo. I thought about the children I had raised, the neighbors who had known us all our lives, and the small rituals that held us together, mending seams, offering tea, sharing a prayer before a long day. I thought of the little back house, and of how it would look if someone were to make it home in a way that was meant to exile rather than to ease. The thought made my hands clench. I sat back down at the kitchen table and opened the box of photographs. My fingers brushed the edge of Rafael's school picture and then rested on a letter from Geraldo tied with a ribbon. The letter was short. He always believed in saying a thing plainly. He had written, "Keep the house, keep the work, keep your heart open." I read those words as if they were a map, and I folded the letter within my palm like a talisman. The next morning, when the men came by to check the fence, I told them nothing about the car or the motel or the messages. I simply asked them to do what they had always done: fix a gate, check the water pump, see to the lambs. There is honor in continuity. There is also strategy in showing that life goes on. I wanted the world outside our household to remain a steady witness. The neighbors see what they see. They know who does the work that keeps the farm alive. If the house were to be challenged, I wanted the village's memory of our labors to stand with us. The weeks stretched on like quilted patches. There were small triumphs: a good season of oats, the steadying of the cattle market, a neighbor's child learning to braid hair in the kitchen as they had in our house when Rafael was young. There were small wounds as well. Nights when Rafael and I spoke in low voices and did not find the right words. Afternoons when Vivian's laughter made the glass on the shelves tremble as if warning. But I continued to collect details, to write dates, to ask careful questions of the people I trusted. I kept my resolve like one keeps an ember, guarded against wind. And then one day, as I was closing the ledger in the courtroom of life that is the farmhouse shelf, Rafael turned to me with a face that had been smoothed by too much thinking and said, "Mama, I don't know how we got here." He sounded lost in the way people sound when they realize a map has been folded inside out. "I don't either, child," I said. "But we will look. We will look together." My words were simple, and I meant them. I did not want to fix him in accusation. I wanted him to come back to the place where his feet knew the earth. He nodded, but he did not step closer. The distance between us had become tangible, like the space between two chairs that once faced each other in conversation. I thought of the small back house and how, if the worst came, I could live there. But I also thought of the father who had built the kitchen where we sat, and of the life that had been stitched in its curtains. I thought about standing tall enough to be mistaken for a fence post sometimes, silent but steady. I wanted Rafael to see me in that steadiness and to choose the path of returning. Late that evening, as the house hummed with the ordinary sound of settling timber, there was a soft knock at the back door. I opened it and found a neighbor, old Miguel, his hat in hand and his eyes as kind as they had been when he first met Geraldo. He spoke in small, steady sentences. "Your boy has been seen with that car," he said, as if telling me the weather. People in town talk. I thanked him without bitterness. Rumor travels fast, and in a village that is small, the truth sometimes arrives on the back of gossip. But gossip can also save you if you know how to listen to it with a mind that separates noise from signal. The next steps were delicate. There is a way to gather evidence that honors dignity, and another that rivets shame like a nail. I chose the former. I called the neighbor who had seen the car and asked him to keep watch. I asked Maria, the hired girl, to note the times Vivian left. I wrote dates in my little book and counted like a woman tallying eggs after a storm. Each small thing I recorded was a stitch in a seam I hoped would be strong. When I walked through the rooms, I looked at the photographs on the mantel and touched them as if to reassure myself that we were not simply a house of passing things. I thought of the way the morning sun hit the table just so, and how Geraldo would point to the spot and tell me to put the loaf there. I told myself over and over that I was protecting more than walls. I was protecting a lineage of work and a story that had been part of me since I first learned to knead dough. One afternoon, after a week that seemed to hold more shadows than usual, I received a message from Joaquim asking me to come with what I had. He would be at the office, he said, in an hour. I folded up my notes and took the photograph of Rafael and the frog. I tucked them into my bag because sometimes a story needs the weight of its past to stand steady. I felt the strange calm again, and with it, a sense of purpose that steady people sometimes feel before a change. As I walked out the gate, the sun warmed my back and the scent of hay rose like an old scent that tells the world what season it is. I felt each step as if laying them carefully on the path ahead, because the path no longer belonged to me alone, but to the memory of my husband and the future of my son. I felt each step as if laying them carefully on the path ahead, because the path no longer belonged to me alone, but to the memory of my husband and the future of my son. I walked into Joaquim's office with a weight in my hands that felt equal parts sorrow and resolve. He met me at the door like he always did, steady, a little bent as if the world had pressed him down a bit but hadn't broken him. He made room on the leather chair, and I set the phone, the folded note of dates, and the photograph of Rafael with the frog between us like offerings. He looked at the things, then at me, then at the little sprawl of papers I had tucked into my purse. Receipts, a corner of a bill that had Vivian's name in ink, a note from old Miguel about the car. He did not raise his eyebrows. He had the patience of someone who had watched neighbors hurt one another across fences for decades and learned that hasty movements tend to splinter everything. "We will look," he said simply, and began to sort what I had given him as if arranging seeds by size. There are many kinds of courage. One is the kind that shows up with a raised voice and a clenched fist. Another is the kind that puts one thing after another onto a table and asks a few sensible questions. I had picked the latter. I wanted to be right because truth is kinder than lies. Lies shelter a life built on sand. I wanted the house to be on rock. So Joaquim called some people quietly. He spoke into his phone in a voice that did not carry beyond his neat office. He asked one of his clerks to thumb through the old deed boxes at the county office and to see what signatures had been recorded when Geraldo's name had been added to the property ledger years back. He asked a neighbor who had kept an eye on things to note when that dark car had been seen entering the lane. We did not broadcast suspicion. We built a case like one seeds a garden, with attention and patience. The day the clerk returned to the office with a photocopy of the old deed, I remember the way the paper felt under my fingers. Thin and warm, like something alive. There it was in black ink. The lines that tied the land together. Names and dates, signatures that had once been scrawled by a hand steady as a plowman's. My name. It was there beside Geraldo's, in the long-ago hand of a man who had no reason to hide things from me, because we had been partners in everything that mattered. My name, clear as a bell. The house, the barn, the fields, not simply the memory of them, but a legal fact that had been put down and, until that moment, forgotten under years of ordinary life. I think what struck me most was not the confirmation of ownership, that I had a paper that said so, but the quiet injustice of forgetting. It felt like a blanket laid over a stove. It muffled heat and danger until you almost forgot the flame. The deed sitting on my lap was not vengeance. It was a reminder of what had been built by two calloused hands and the life that had been lived. Sir Joachim spoke with the softness of a man who knew how brittle people are. "This belongs to you as much as it ever did," he said, not loudly, not triumphantly. "Whatever else happens, the record is the record." He told me there were complications. There often are. But his way of speaking made me feel he would pick them apart like a man separating thread from cloth. He did not promise me the outcome of any courthouse drama, because life is not a play with guaranteed applause. He promised only to do the careful work needed to protect what ought to remain guarded. Knowing that the deed existed changed the shape of my days. It did not make the kitchen warmer or the nights shorter, but it steadied me. It gave me a place to stand. I kept going about my chores, but I moved with a new steadiness. The kind that belongs to people who have put a fence post deep in the earth and found it will not rock. I kept gathering the small pieces that would make a whole story. A receipt here, a witness there. I wrote dates in my notebook and underlined them as if I were creating constellations. The week that followed is a blur of small movements that add up to one big turning. There was the night Rafael did not come in until after the animals were fed. The way his shoulders had hardened into a line I had not liked. There was the afternoon when Vivian left in a hurry and forgot her scarf on the back of the chair. I picked it up like an offering and smelled the perfume she used, and it made me ache because scents are tied to memory the way twine ties hay. Then the phone call came that would break the pretense. A neighbor had seen Vivian's car in the motel parking lot again and had the courage to tell Rafael without dramatizing. He came to the house that evening not in accusation, but in a quietness that made the walls lean in to listen. He held the facts like something he could not bear alone. He had been with the dark car at the motel, he said, had seen the people in it with his own eyes. He had walked into a room and been wrong-footed by truth. The way he told it made my heart constrict with a hurt older than any headline. He looked at me as men sometimes look when they must choose between two things they love, but one of which has been harmed by the other. For the first time since that morning at the table, he put both hands on mine and did not flinch away. His hands were calloused from work, and now from worry. "Mama," he said, and it was the first time I heard humility in his voice. "I should have seen it sooner. I should have—" He stopped. No man can carry the weight of every mistake. Some must be set down to be examined and mended. I had never wanted him to see the motel in such a way. I had wanted him to be spared the sharpness of betrayal. But the moment he saw with his own eyes, the thin curtain of denial that had covered him fell away. The motel had done what it does in such stories. It made truth visible. When a thing is placed under light, it either reveals itself as true or vanishes. We did not go to the motel like a pair of actors staging a scene. We went with Sir Joachim, with the neighbor who had watched, and with the quietness that comes when truth gathers a small and wise audience. When you need to speak of painful things, having witnesses is like having stones to lay down so you do not slip. There was no shouting. There were small, solid questions. There were facts placed gently but firmly. Rafael walked into the room where Vivian sat, and the look on his face was not of fury, as much as of a person encountering a house of cards. He stood there for a long time, and then he turned away. The conversation that followed in a hallway smelled of cigarette smoke and stale coffee and contained the sound of people who had shaped one another and were now being reshaped by undeniable facts. Vivian said things that sounded practiced. She accused me once, in a voice that tried to be sharp but fell thin. "You set this," she said, and the words looked awkward on her like two large gloves. I did not answer. What happened next was not spectacle. Vivian left the motel not in a carriage of scandal, but quietly, with a suitcase and a face that had the stiffness of someone who has been exposed to wind for too long. She left a mess of things behind. A half-drunk cup, a ring, some receipts, the evidence of a life tied in knots. We did not throw the contents into the yard or parade them. We documented, we recorded, and we brought everything, photographs, papers, receipts, to Sir Joachim, with the humility that comes from knowing that shame is not a weapon for the wise. There were consequences that unfolded faster than I had guessed, and slower than my heart desired. Papers uncovered debts in Vivian's name. Small loans here, a line of credit there. Some of the items suggested an attempt to position herself in ways that would have advantaged her in the event of Rafael's absence. Others suggested nothing but careless living. I am not an accountant, and I will not pretend to be. Joachim explained that some of the documents could be contested, that signatures often carry more muster than words, and that sometimes people sign things without understanding them. I listened and kept my voice measured. I had not wanted this to be a courtroom drama where one life is turned into a spectacle. I wanted it to be a tidy, honest clearing out. There is a particular kind of humiliation that falls on someone when the curtain between a public life and a private one is pulled aside. I felt no joy in Vivian's discomfort. I felt something older, a fierce desire to keep my son from living inside of a lie. I had lost my husband. I had thought grief was scarcity of love, but grief is many things. One of them is the need to protect what remains. When the legal papers were read, the deed, the will, the documents left by Geraldo in his hand, there was a strange relief in the way the house gathered itself around us. It was not triumph. It was like a family roll call, calling names, placing them where they belonged. The deed confirmed what had been between two people for decades, and what, for reasons of haste or oversight, had been overlooked now. It did not erase the months of pain. It simply marked one truth plainly. The land carried both our names, and that fact was as solid as the timber of the house. Vivian's interest in the property, which she had framed as affection for the future, was exposed to be more complicated than she had let on. Papers that linked her to outside debt suggested motives other than care for the farm. I will not multiply humiliation with adjectives. I will say this. Once truth is given a place to stand, it tends to walk as it must. The law, in its plodding way, agreed that the deed said what it said. We had counsel who would not let the house be moved in a night. I am not an advocate of courthouse battles for entertainment. I am simply telling you that the paper that recorded our lives was now being honored as a thing that could protect us. Rafael's remorse was not a sudden absolution. It came in small steps, an apology whispered over dishes, a hand that reached for mine across a table and did not look away. He worked in silence for weeks, doing what he did best, repairing fences, mending pumps, setting roofs true. There is something about honest work that mends the fabric of people. He returned to rituals that had once been his, and that had perhaps been dulled by the glare of something new. He began to sit with me in the evenings again, listening to the radio, finding joy in the simple things. The house regained a measure of normal that is not perfect, but true. We did not immediately resume our old closeness as if nothing had happened. Trust, once cracked, has to be rebuilt board by board. There were evenings when he would stand in the doorway and I would see the way his shoulders carried the memory of his choices. He went to see people in town and apologized, not for the exposure of Vivian, but for what his silence had cost us. He mended things without words often. He fixed the porch swing with a patience I had watched him admire in his father. I watched him with a softness I had buried behind anger for a while, and it came back to me that men, like houses, sometimes need the steadying of hands to remember who they are. Vivian left, and the town murmured around it as towns do. People made their judgments in low voices near the bakery, at the market stand, by the church gate. Some kept their distance. Others, who had once been polite, were kinder to me in ways that felt like bandages, meals left on the porch, a neighbor stopping by for no reason, but to sit with me while the kettle warmed. Donna Sebastiana made a stew and sat with me for an afternoon, and in her presence the world seemed less sharp. There were no fireworks, no scenes of melodrama. There was only the quiet, unremarkable business of people rearranging their lives. Time, the slow heir to everything, did its work. The months rolled like hay bales down the lane. Rafael and I spoke less about blame and more about care. We made inventories of assets, of animal counts, of seeds needed for the spring. We sat with Joachim and signed papers that clarified the ownership, not as a triumph but as a protection. He did not celebrate with champagne. He sat with the documents as if they were fragile glass and handled them gently. We found, too, among the old papers, notes from Geraldo that read like bits of a map. He had been a man who liked to write down what he thought mattered, and his handwriting, crooked and sure, gave me small comforts. In the slow months that followed, I began to see the colors of new life return in small ways. Rafael found work beyond what the farm demanded for a while. He helped a neighboring farmer bring in hay. He did repairs on the county road crew. These were not escapes, but repairs. He was building muscle and character in ways that did not involve distance. He learned to carry his guilt like a shirt that had been washed and mended. It fit him differently, but it fit. And then, as if life could not resist offering tenderness after a long season of storm, a woman came to our town who had been raised on a nearby farm. Her name was Ana Paula. She came to the general store to buy flour and then to return it because she had miscounted. She carried with her a steadiness that did not pretend at wisdom, but had the warmth of someone who had been taught how to set a table and how to keep a word. She spoke to me one afternoon about the best way to plant tomatoes so they do not get blight. She brought seeds from her mother's garden, seeds that had been in the family for generations. There was nothing dramatic about her arrival. She baked a loaf and brought half of it to my porch in a brown paper bag with a ribbon. The ribbon was small and the loaf was warm, and the gesture had in it the kind of kindness that is like a key. Rafael met her first, with the shaky caution of a man who had been burned by what he once believed in. They began slowly, and when I say slowly, I mean like the growth of a plant that prefers to take root before it reaches sky. Ana Paula did not come with grand promises or quick solutions. She came with steady hands and an appetite for small tasks. She listened to the stories we told of Geraldo and sometimes added a line about her own father that made us smile. She learned to knead bread in my kitchen the way someone learns to read a book by tracing the letters with a neat finger. There were those in town who scoffed that Rafael had chosen again so quickly. But life is not a ledger that tallies grief against joy and then gives you a neat verdict. People are messy and then beautiful. Ana Paula did not arrive to fix what had been broken. She arrived as someone who wanted to be part of a life already lived. She respected things that were small but sacred. My place by the stove, the way I left a teaspoon in the drawer because I liked it there. She asked my advice about rabbit traps and how to bind a sprain. She called me Mama once, not too soon but not too late, and the word settled into me like a seed settling into soil. Months gave way to new habits. Rafael and Ana Paula planted a row of sunflowers that leaned toward the south like a classroom of little students learning where the sun sits. I found myself giving Ana Paula my bread recipe and receiving in return a jar of preserves with tiny cherries gleaming like beads. She would come to the garden with a sun hat like a little crown and say, "We should plant more basil." And I would answer, "We always plant more basil." There were apologies that did not need to be repeated. The work that needed doing, feeding, mending, listening, got done, and in the doing, our relations smoothed. I will not tell you everything was easy. It was not. Trust heals slowly, and memory has a stubbornness about it. Some nights Rafael would sleep with the lights still on, and sometimes his voice would catch when he told a story that once made us all laugh. But there was a gentleness growing. It made a home more honest by degrees. Years do that when they are given a chance. They turn sharp stones into river-smoothed pebbles. One spring, when the fields smelled of green and new rain, Ana Paula came to me with hands that trembled not with fear but with news. She had a little burst of light in her voice that is peculiar to expectant mothers. "Mama," she said, her eyes bright, "we're having a baby." The words struck me the way good news often does, sudden and clean. I cried in the kitchen with the kettle whistling for a moment, not because the story was complete, but because life had decided to be generous. The weeks that followed were full of the ordinary preparations that make a cradle into a reality. Measuring blankets, checking the mattress in the small room down the hall that used to hold mismatched chairs, setting aside a drawer for tiny things. Rafael came to me more often without embarrassment now. He would ask things he once thought he should have known and did not. We spoke of little things, how to wrap a baby with the right snugness so it does not shiver, which herbs to brew for a mother after she gives birth. We mended an old rocking chair and painted its arms with slow, careful strokes. In those small sessions, we wove ourselves back together. When the baby came, a girl with my jaw in her mouth and Geraldo's brow in her forehead, there was a hush, as if the house were holding its breath to listen. She smelled of milk and warm linen, and when Rafael held her the first time, his face was full in a way that made me feel, for the first time since the first days of hurt, that we had returned to a safe shore. He looked at me, and then at the child, and then at Ana Paula, and something in him had been made ready. The town celebrated in its quiet way. Neighbors came with pies and folded quilts. We had a small naming at the kitchen table, where the photographs on the mantel seemed to lean forward like old friends. I thanked God in a way that felt like handing back a scarf to the cold, humble and grateful. I kept my thanks simple because gratitude is not always loud. In time, the house felt whole again. Not the same, no house is the same after pain, but reshaped by the work of people who decided to stay and fix, to speak, to listen. There were visits from Vivienne, brief and polite, the kind that keep people safe from being dragged into more hurt. She kept her distance, and we allowed space. The law had done its small part. The deed stood true. The farm continued to feed us and the animals to rely on human hands. Our community did what small towns do best. They remembered who we were and matched us to that memory. When I look back on that year now, I think of the way truth has a light that is not always harsh. It may reveal stains, and sometimes it opens wounds that had been kept closed, but it also shows the things worth protecting. The farm, the kitchen table, the box of photographs, these were not simply things. They were the threads of a life. Protecting them was not an act of bitterness. It was an act of fidelity. People sometimes ask me whether I feel triumphant, whether my choice to gather what I gathered and to let the law do its slow work felt like winning. I tell them no. I felt like a woman who had been asked to stand in the doorway of her life and decide whether to keep it or to let it go. I chose to keep it, not to punish anyone, but to preserve what had been entrusted to me. It was not about proving someone wrong. It was about making sure the story we handed to the next generation was not built on falsehoods. There are lessons tucked into the pages of that time, lessons about dignity, about how a person can resist being diminished without trying to diminish others. I learned that a mother's love can be fierce and quiet at the same time. I learned that evidence, when presented with prudence and respect, can protect rather than destroy. I learned that forgiveness is not an immediate thing, but a series of small acts that let the heart open again. Now, when the morning light slips over the porch and touches the table where once a slammed word fell like a hammer, I feel a gratitude that is steady, not showy. Rafael sits at the table with his daughter and traces the curve of her ear like a man learning patience. Ana Paula hums as she chops onions and tells stories of her mother's garden. I knit sometimes, and sometimes I bake, and sometimes I sit for long minutes looking at the willow where Geraldo once carved our initials. When visitors come and ask what the recipe is, I answer as if sharing a secret. When neighbors come in hard times, I make them tea and put a hand on their shoulder. The house now is a place with room for things, old mistakes included, but taught not to let them live there. If you are hearing this and you have felt the sharpness of being pushed aside by someone you love, know this. You are not a chapter that ends with an insult. There are steps you can take that preserve your dignity, that ask for help instead of taking revenge, that use witnesses and care rather than spectacle. I am not saying every story ends as ours did. I only tell you what happened to me. Life is particular. Outcomes differ. But there is a steadiness that comes from choosing to act with patience and firmness, from placing truth on the table rather than accusations in the street. I will close with a small image that has kept me warm: the kitchen table, sunlight on its grain, a small hand holding a piece of bread, a man and a woman who have learned to carry their history without letting it crush the future. That table held sorrow and laughter, decisions and forgiveness. It still does. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs hope. And if you want to hear more true life testimonies, consider subscribing so we can sit at the next kitchen table together and listen.